And next we have Jack Pyburn. We'll get your title right here, Jack. Principal of the Historic Preservation Studio of Lord Aiken Sargent Architects. Jack is going to talk about the next phase of the
Thank you, Jason. Everybody here all right? It's a terrific sequence here. I first want to thank Jason and the center for putting this on. It couldn't have been a better timing for us to have the opportunity to be exposed to everything that you all have brought to this program to this point. I will say that I've learned a great deal. Probably the most useful piece of information and advice I've learned here is that it's helpful to have at least 3 very strong, influential women who have access to money as a way to get this thing going. But I will say that the Paradise Gardens opportunity, I think, is a special one. As all of you know, in dealing with these, with sites like this, they're very complex. They have personality as an integral part to them, and they're projects that don't happen overnight and require resources. So, in effect, the moons have to cross for a project like this to be successful. I've had the fortune of working on a number of different types of sites, from a presidential library to other folk art sites, and all of them have their complexities to achieve the objectives for visitation and resources to keep them going and to treat them properly. I thought this was a good title, and certainly there's been a lot of discussion about personality in the center of folk art sites, and Finster was no deviation from that. And Southern Baptist, and I mean that in 2 words, not one, culture, there are ministers, and ministers are those who care for their flock, and there are evangelists, and they are performers. And while Howard Finster had a church for many years, and in fact did much ministering, at heart, Howard Finster was a performer. And interestingly, in comparing this site with other sites we've seen, Paradise Garden is an environment that supported Howard's personality. You came into Howard's psyche and you came into Howard's environment to experience Paradise Garden. Unlike the whirligigs, which are certainly something you came to experience, but they were of a scale and a character that was significantly different from the circumstances at Paradise Gardens. Jordan mentioned just a bit about our team. We felt that it was, we needed a team that represented a cross-section of issues. Jordan mentioned something very important about this project as it's unfolding and as it in fact has developed, is that a major objective of the investment in Paradise Garden is about economic development. It was not done from the foundation of just wanting to restore the site or preserve the site. It was done to be an economic asset to one of the more depressed areas in Appalachia. And so it's an interesting set of conditions that will be influencing this project as it moves forward. And Carolyn Brackett was an important piece of our team in bringing that heritage tourism piece to our consideration. One of the last projects Tony Rager worked on. Tony came to the site about 3 weeks before he died, wrote me a memo. We talked about it on the phone. We were to talk the next week in more depth about his perspective about treatment. He had some recommendations. He documented observations of conditions he saw and so forth. So it was a great loss to our team, and not to mention the the larger preservation and conservation community. We also have a wonderful group of advisors who are helping us. Just the North Dakota info today is a great revelation to me. It hadn't come up in our discussions, and it'll be a great resource. And we have others in Tommy Littleton. Tommy purchased the site from the Finsters in about 2007 and has held it to this point in being its almost sole preserver. He deserves great credit for what remains there and keeping it intact. Tommy has been a wonderful resource. Thomas Scanlon is one of the major collectors of Howard Finster, and he too has been a great resource and advisor as we've moved through this process. Susan Crowley at the High Museum. Also, they have some important pieces of Finsters that are in the museum collection. Tom Patterson, who is a biographer of Finsters, will be visiting the site with me on Monday and giving me and us his perspective about what he's observed today in relation to what he experienced when he was doing the biographical work. Just an important piece of info here. Finster moved to the site in '61 from Tryon, Georgia, which is just a few miles north. He died in 2001, and his daughter took ownership of the property, consolidated it from the family. She held it until '07 when Tommy Littleton purchased it from her, and then Chautauqua County bought it in 2011. I really had a graphic in mind here that I wanted to create that showed Finster's energy level, Finster's activity level that peaked in some time around the early 90s. And as it started going down, and he focused on doing more pieces of art and less work in the garden, that to me is really the point in which the garden's decline started, not when he died, but really more in the early 90s when he was giving his attention to elsewhere. I think there probably was some combination of critical mass and what an individual and their limited resources could do to keep it up, and it got to its peak, and at that point these other factors kicked in. So I think the mid-90s, which really means that for about 20 years now there's been very little happening at the site, and so that's what we're dealing with today. I want to give you a little bit of an orientation for those of you who haven't been there. This is I-75 between Chattanooga and Atlanta. You can see Atlanta's about 90 miles, Chattanooga 43. This is the site, and it's about 30 miles from the interstate. So it's approximately halfway between Chattanooga and Atlanta, off into a topographic zone that is the Appalachian ridges that come down through North Georgia and into Alabama. So you go over a series of ridges as you move across the state in that direction. In Somerville, the site is actually in the community of Pennville, which is here. This is actually a state prison right behind the site. You can't see it from the site, but it's just over the hill. This is downtown Somerville, and it's about 2 miles from downtown Somerville. This is the site in the Pennville neighborhood. Pennville neighborhood is a very low-density, suburban, if you will, subdivision environment, modest houses, and it is the bulk of this block, which as you can see a pond here. The prison site is right over here, just off the screen. This is a little bit closer up site. This is Howard's first house here. He then moved over to this site. This has been since he died, the entry point, but the primary activity points when Finster was alive was on this corner and on this corner. This is the World Folk Art Church here. As Jordan mentioned, he produced about 46,000 pieces of work. If you don't own one, you ought to be ashamed of yourself. I've ginned up these numbers on the 250, and I may be wrong on that, but I think the second part is right. But in terms of major pieces of work, fixed pieces of work, my estimate is somewhere between 250 and 500 pieces were there in its heyday. I think today there's something less than 100. And many of the pieces, or some of the pieces are big pieces, like the coin man that you've seen images of is in a private collection now. There are 2 structures that were on the site that are in private collections now. So there have been some significant pieces that are fortunately preserved and conserved very well, but are in fact no longer on the site. So there's a trade-off there. And in fact, Howard was the primary piece of garden art. Everybody I've talked to that encountered the site spend most of their time, despite the drama that you've seen in all these images over the course of the last couple of days, the conversation is dominated about the interaction with Howard Finster. The site really did support this amazing performer. I wish I had a copy of it, but if you ever had the chance to see Howard Finster on the Johnny Carson show, it personifies Howard Finster as a performer. He is absolutely amazing, and I was thinking last night, who would you compare him against? And I can tell you that he would hold his own with Steve Martin. He was just an amazing performer. He was the consummate bricolier. He was a handyman. He claimed to have learned 20 trades. He was the master of none, I can tell you. He was a wonderfully creative guy, but his capacity, I would say, his best work from a building standpoint was concrete. His concrete work has held up surprisingly good, surprisingly well. But there are many things about the construction, just as all of you have experienced. Howard had similar kind of traits. The garden was not sort of a progressive evolution. I would describe it as more of a stream of consciousness. Howard was described to me, and somewhere in it it's recorded, said that every night the Lord told him what to do the next day. And so he got up and did it. And I'm sure there were days he did things in sequence, but there were also days the Lord was sending him off on tangents. And the progression was really held together more about the theme, the salvation theme, than by some progressive sequence through the site. And I think that's important as we convert all of this to an approach to interpretation, an approach to treatment. Thinking about how this site was organized and, in fact, how the site was experienced. Because until Howard Finster died, the site was open. There was no fence around it. There's a fence around it today, obviously for security reasons. But people wandered into the site. You just parked on the road and wandered in, and you eventually intercepted Howard, and then you were engaged. So how you take that kind of experience that is what he had created within a fenced area, I think becomes a very important part of the consideration about how you interpret, how you experience, and how you treat the resources that are there. So here are some of this wonderful set of videos you saw are just terrific. I'm sure all of you know, the first name of this place was the Plant Farm. And Howard was a farmer. He went around asking, he got done with people, gave him plants. And you can see the role vegetation played in not just the environment, but in the construct of the environment. It was creating rooms and spaces and forms and all with plant material. I think that's probably the most devastated piece of the site that's almost gone. It's been taken over by invasive plant material like privet and something that we'll need to, be working through archives and so forth, be able to decide how that piece of it can be retained. Water, and I'll show you a little more about water. Water is a very important part of this site, both from a good and a bad standpoint. There are about 18 structures, and I think Howard, I'll do a little more work on this, but I think Howard actually only did from scratch 3 of them, and I would say 2.5, in that the Royal Folk Art Church, actually he cut the center out of the roof, which structurally that was another, he didn't understand shear and lateral bracing, and he didn't understand flashing were 2 major deficiencies he had in his building repertoire. But there were a lot of structures that he inherited and adapted on the site. There was applied art, site-built sculpture, and you'll see some of that here in a minute. You've already seen some. Assemblies and displays, things like light catchers that he used to reflect many of these other, you've seen in other sites, similar kind of treatments. Materials are across the board. Unlike Eddie Owens Martin, who used concrete, chicken wire, and Sherwin-Williams paint, Finster, while he used tractor paint, he did, for a conservator that's going to be helpful, is that he did, his paint source was fairly consistent. He used all kinds of materials. He has Polaroid images embedded in a concrete wall. He has pieces of magazine embedded in a concrete wall. He has glass, plastic, paper, the whole spectrum. He used washing machines as formwork to build some of his site pieces. So it's a very complex site from a conservation standpoint, and we'll take a lot of care to treat it properly as we move forward. So this image is taken from what's been called Tommy's house. It's been called a photographer stand. It's showing the waterway coming through the site, the renewable planter that he had, and particularly the wire system that supported both the light catchers and the vegetation, which is pretty much gone now. The wire cables are substantially gone at this point. Another example, just illustrating the density, and the videos did an even better job of demonstrating that density. So you can see virtually one guy trying to keep this up. There was this point that crossed where the energy couldn't keep up with it, and the opportunity to do things that were more accomplishable came into play. Brings into consideration the whole issue of sort of the point of significance that you want to deal with, or how you deal with this environment that changed over time and peaked and then started to decline. This was, when you saw that image of the arbor, this is that same view today. This is from the original entrance, which was what is now called, and was at the time, the Vision House. It's owned by an art dealer in Chicago. So it's outside the property, but it was the backyard of that property was the original entrance into the site. This is from the upper area of the church, looking out over the site. One of the last structures built in the 90s was this walkway, and he wanted handicapped people to be able to get to the site. Unfortunately, when you get to the other end, you encounter a set of stairs, a fairly complicated set of stairs. It does get you where you can see out on the site, but this house is not in the property. The property line runs along here at this point, nor does this property here in the property. And it, in fact, was not in the property when Howard was alive and active. This is the Royal Folk Art Church. This piece had some stabilization work done on it a number of years ago. It did a good job of stabilizing it. The approach to the treatment of it probably can be enhanced some. The building has some significant issues. As I said, Finster cut a hole in the roof, just cut a big hole and built this thing through it. Fortunately, it was a circle, which is pretty stable piece of geometry, but the joist connection to it are weak, and there's a fair bit of structural work to be done there. This is another shot of the walkway. I would say from an architectural standpoint, the lateral bracing on this piece is certainly enhanced by the 90-degree angle, but when you get out to the ends, it becomes less stable, and an area where it has, it's just post in the ground as well in a very wet environment. So it's starting to rack and needs to be stabilized as well. This is a series of other structures on the site. This is a house actually that Howard built. It's been referred to as Pauline's house. That's his wife. He built it for Pauline. I've heard some say, no, it really wasn't for Pauline. In fact, to my knowledge at this point, nobody's ever lived in the house, nor I'm sure that there's been a major use in the house. It's also referred to on some drawings as a display area. Now it is this. And in fact, that's more typical of every structure on the site. So there's this combination of debris and objects that have to be sorted out in order to be able to certainly even structurally examine the buildings thoroughly, adequately, but also to make decisions about how to interpret the site in the future, what you keep, what you don't keep, how do you make sense of this and have that sense communicate the discombobulated nature of the hoarding sort of nature that this represents. Howard, in addition to his, or as a part of his sort of salvation theology, celebrated creativity of man and what God gave man in the ability to create, just as God created the earth. And his way of manifesting that was to collect one of everything that man and humans had made. So part of this assortment that fills all of the buildings on the site is his effort to collect and present everything that has humanly been made. He got a lot of bicycle parts. He was a bicycle repairman. So he got some of them duplicate many times over. Here's a piece of assembly, of metal-related assembly. This is a concrete piece on the site, the serpent piece. This was a building, I'm sure Howard didn't build it. It's a building I think that probably came with the site, as was some of the other buildings. The bicycle tower, this is the bicycle tower today, for those of you who may have seen pictures of the bicycle tower in its heyday. This is a Keith Haring piece that sits down in a little draw between two waterways, and it's also showing signs of significant deterioration. Keith Haring developed a communication and association with Howard at a point. This is some of the concrete wall that is an important piece just to see how things are going here. I need to speed this up a little bit. I want to show you, this is the site. This is the about 2.5 acre site. On the left is what it was in '88, and in 2012, this is what it is today. Two sides of the site are deteriorated. These two sides, in terms of a neighborhood deterioration, mostly vacant. This is an out parcel. This is an out parcel. Major drainage point here and viable neighborhood there. The water isn't important. Howard bought basically a lowlands tract and spent his life trying to manage the water through the tract. So if we're going to preserve this tract for a public entity to be able to maintain it, this is going to have to be managed upstream so we can manage the water coming through the site that can represent Howard's desired design and function of it. The yellow area, and just thinking about the important parts of the site and trying to deal with priorities, this is certainly the garden piece. It is the earliest piece. It's where virtually all of the sculpture and composition that Howard put into the site was. This was an important piece during the music period. This is where he was when they were doing the music videos. This is the church, which is certainly an iconic piece on the outside, very serious conditions on the inside. And then this is the Cadillac garage, the small chapel, the bicycle tower, and the house. So that's the components. If you try to break it down a little bit, that's the different zones of characteristic. I mentioned the 3 points of entry. This is the only point of entry that's in control of the county. Probably the most appropriate point at this point anyway. And here I was just trying to illustrate the ways people got into the site. So in terms of capturing this vision and how do you deal with it, approach to treatment and interpretation into the future, it seems, and authenticity is a tricky word, but it seems that it remaining legitimate, and my view is that the most meaningful this site will ever be is as it is today because it's got what's left of Howard. Everything else is going to be as an intervention, however sensitive or not it is. It needs intervention, but how you make that intervention becomes a very critical piece of the exercise. So it's about, to me, how do you capture his spirit? Well, he used light, he used wind, he used nature, he used plant material. That was a vitality that he built into it. He took a nail. When he made reflectors, he would put the nail on an angle, he would punch a hole, and when the wind blew, the aluminum panel would work up the nail. And then when the wind subsided, it would work back down the nail. Yeah, so he had all these tricks about how to capture light, and I think that's one of the ways you capture Howard. The other, he left us a lot of writing on the site. And so there's Howard in the writing, as was mentioned earlier. So I think those are important things to consider. One of the things that's so little of the art is on the site. I've been thinking about the Ben Franklin wireframe kind of idea. This piece is in a collection. If it were in a public accessible area, you could create a similar kind of concept with a optical reading code. You could get the information about the piece. You could see where the piece is. It would create a collection, a link to these other collections in North Georgia and elsewhere that one then could carry their interest in the site further. We're just looking for ways to how to bring the sort of critical mass of density back, and particularly with the important pieces, but also connect them to the real pieces so that people see this as one starting point for a bigger journey. Stabilization is critical. Documentation is critical. We just need a site survey of what's on the site, a good surveyors. A hydrology study, measured drawings, all of these things are critical in documentation. And then doing this curatorial exercise, then developing the strategies for treatment, and then implementation. So there's some very important steps. We're at a very early phase, while all of the other administrative operation and marketing stuff is happening. In terms of the challenges, time is a challenge. Time, I don't think, is on the side of any site like this. And in particular, when the county has made a commitment to have this be an asset for its economic development and employment and those sorts of things, time becomes important. Risk is a factor. All of a sudden, this is in the public domain, and we have buildings that have, and conditions that do represent some risk in a public domain. So being able to manage that becomes very important. The audiences, I think, are absolutely critical. I think there are multiple audiences, and how you can shape this experience so that it can draw as many audiences as possible becomes particularly important. defining a self-sustaining framework. I think there are also opportunities. I think there's significant, as I said at the outset, there's significant interest in success, and there's important people from the congressman to the community leadership who are wanting this to happen. And I think the potential for linking it to the economic opportunities for the county. And then there is significant fabric impact. As discouraging as some of these images can be, there is significant fabric impact that can be worked with. So that's where we are. Thank you.
Do we have any questions for that? Question, Dennis.
Pardon?
Jack's cell phone, I think.
Well, I would say, I mean, Jordan, maybe to get a full introduction, Jordan was the Director of Preservation in Mount Vernon. He's from Somerville, Georgia. I mean, when you talk about Moon's Crossing and the importance of local legitimacy and small town life, these things are extremely important. So this is just one example of the kind of conditions that have come together that I think are exceptional in terms of the potential it holds for success.
I have one question for you, Jack, and for Jordan too. In the future vision for the site, is there any hopes of trying to bring back either pieces from the garden or just, I mean, if he's got 46,000 works of art, trying to bring some, purchase some of those to bring back to show more of his art at the site?
Well, I mean, I think all of those things are questions down the road that will have to be answered. I think certainly the foundation has got, thanks to Tommy Littleton, who kept and has provided them back to the foundation, has a whole locker full of things that can be shown and can make sufficient critical mass for a traveling exhibition. So I think the answer to that is yes. Now, will the High Museum pieces come back to the garden? I don't think so. Will Thomas Scanlon's pieces come back to the garden? Probably not. Thomas Scanlon's also interested in his collection becoming a public collection at some point. So you can see that you could scan this barcode and get a sense of the object on the site, and then you can go over to Dahlonega, Georgia, and you could see this piece, any given piece that he might have, that would be, that you could see the piece that was conserved and in an environment that it could be protected. I think in that way it has this opportunity to broaden the experience of the impact of Howard Finster by taking you to places that you might not otherwise go, and understanding how broadly his appeal was felt in the past and continues.
There were times